Sir, could you please give me a little more? Behind the counter, Mr. Harold Carter pushed his reading glasses higher on his nose and looked again at the bicycle in front of him. He sighed and wiped his hands on a rag. Kid, he said gently, $20 is already a good price for something this old. He pointed toward the faded pink bicycle Annie was holding. Look at the chain rusted. The paint's almost gone. And that seat is patched up with tape. I'd have to spend more than 20 just fixing it. He shook his head. Truth is, that price is already higher than what most folks would offer. She hesitated, then spoke again. Could you maybe add a little more? Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. A little more? Yes, sir. She gently touched the torn seat. This is the only bike I have. The mechanic leaned on the counter. Well then, he said slowly. Why are you trying to sell it? Annie took a breath. My mom saved money for a long time to buy it for me. Mr. Carter's expression softened slightly. Oh yeah? She nodded. She worked extra shifts for months. She said every kid should have something that's just theirs. For a moment, Annie looked at the bicycle as if remembering the day she first received it. But I want to help the kids at the shelter, she said quietly. What shelter? Mr. Carter asked. Hope Haven. The old mechanic knew the place. A small shelter in an old church building a few blocks away. There are a lot of kids there, Annie continued. Some nights they don't have enough food. Her voice remained calm, but there was something deeply serious about the way she spoke. I've been trying to collect money. Mr. Carter crossed his arms. What have you sold already? My dolls. And? My books. And now the bike. Annie nodded slowly. It's the last thing I have. Mr. Carter exhaled. You're telling me your mama worked overtime to buy you that bike. He gestured toward the pink frame. And now you want to sell it? Annie lifted her head. The kids there need help more than I do. The mechanic stared at her quietly for a moment. Neither of them noticed the man sitting at the coffee shop window next door. Daniel Whitaker had been waiting for his morning coffee. The coffee shop window looked directly toward Carter's bike repair, and through the open door, Daniel had heard everything. Daniel slowly lowered the newspaper he had been reading. Without thinking, he stood up. He left a few bills beside the half-finished cup of coffee and quickly walked toward the auto repair shop. Mr. Carter glanced up. Daniel looked at the bicycle, then at the little girl holding it. You're trying to sell this bike? He asked gently. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. Daniel crouched slightly so he could speak at her eye level. Why? So I can give the money to the kids at Hope Haven Shelter. Daniel studied the worn bicycle again. You know this looks like your favorite bike. My mom bought it for me, Annie said. Daniel smiled faintly. That must have taken her a while. It did. For a moment no one spoke. Then Daniel asked quietly, if you sell the bike, how will you get to school? Annie shrugged a little. I can walk. Mr. Carter frowned. That's almost 2 miles from here. I don't mind, Annie said softly. Daniel looked at her for a long second. Then he turned toward the mechanic. Mr. Carter, he said politely, do you think you could raise the price a little for her? The old mechanic rubbed the back of his neck. Sir, I'd like to help, but that bike really isn't worth much more. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. Then he reached into his wallet. Well, he said calmly, what if the price changed? Mr. Carter looked confused. Daniel placed several bills on the counter. Could you pay her a little more? He asked. If someone helped cover the difference? The old mechanic stared at the money. Then he looked back at Annie, and finally at the stranger standing beside her. For the first time that morning, the quiet little repair shop felt like something important was about to happen. Daniel Whitaker's hand was still resting on the counter when Mr. Carter slowly pushed the bills back toward him. The old mechanic shook his head. Sir, I appreciate what you're trying to do, he said. But I can't buy that bike for more than it's worth. Annie looked up quickly. Mr. Carter crouched slightly so he was speaking more gently. Kid, I run a small shop. If I start paying high prices for bikes like that, I'd be out of business before the end of the month. He looked again at the worn pink bicycle leaning against the counter. The truth is, this bike is too old for me to pay much for it. Annie's shoulders sank a little, though she tried not to show it. Mr. Carter added kindly, you might have better luck somewhere else. Maybe the pawn shop down on Halstead, or the second-hand store near the bus station. He gave her a small, encouraging smile. Sometimes another shop might give you a better deal. For a moment, the repair shop was quiet. Annie looked down at the bicycle again. Her fingers brushed the faded frame gently. Her mother had worked extra shifts at the diner for months to save enough money to buy it. Annie could still remember the day her mom wheeled it into their apartment hallway. "You deserve something that belongs just to you," her mother had said. Now Annie had brought it here to sell, not because she wanted to, but because the children at Hope Haven needed help. Daniel heard the mechanic refuse the request. He had seen the small change in Annie's posture when she realized the shop wouldn't buy the bike. "Excuse me," he said gently. Both Annie and Mr. Carter looked toward him. Daniel glanced at the bicycle. "So the shop can't buy it?" Mr. Carter shook his head. "I'm afraid not. Not at the price she's hoping for." Daniel nodded slowly. Then he turned toward Annie. "You still want to sell the bike?" Annie hesitated. "Yes, sir." "Even though it was a gift from your mother?" She nodded again. "The kids at the shelter need help more. If Annie's kindness touched your heart, please like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell us where you are watching from. And if you enjoy stories about compassion, courage, and everyday heroes, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story." Daniel studied her face carefully. Daniel reached into his wallet. "Well," he said calmly, "maybe the repair shop doesn't need to buy it." Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. Daniel pulled out several bills and held them toward Annie. "I'll buy it." Annie blinked in surprise. "You will?" "Yes." She looked at the bicycle, then back at him. "But it's really old," she said honestly. Daniel smiled. "I noticed." Mr. Carter crossed his arms and watched with quiet curiosity. "How much are you offering?" the mechanic asked. Daniel looked at Annie. "How much were you hoping to get?" Annie thought for a moment. "I was hoping maybe $40. Daniel nodded. "That seems fair." He handed her the money. Annie stared at the bills in disbelief. "That's really $40? "It is." She looked back at the bicycle again. "You can keep it if you want," she said carefully. "But sometimes the chain gets stuck." Daniel chuckled softly. "I think I can handle that." Annie slowly let go of the handlebars. For a moment she simply stood there, holding the money in both hands. Then she looked up at Daniel again. "Are you a billionaire?" The question came out so suddenly that Mr. Carter nearly laughed. Daniel blinked. "Well," he said with a small smile. "Why do you ask that?" Annie tilted her head. "My grandma watches the news," she explained. "And there's a man named Daniel Whitaker who is very rich." Mr. Carter's eyebrows lifted slightly. Daniel scratched the back of his neck. "That does happen to be my name." Annie's eyes widened. "So you are the billionaire?" Daniel smiled awkwardly. "Something like that." Annie nodded seriously. "Okay." Then she extended her small hand politely. "My name is Annie." Daniel shook her hand gently. "Nice to meet you, Annie." Mr. Carter chuckled quietly from behind the counter. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. Daniel crouched down so he was eye level with her. "So, Annie," he said, "what are you going to do with the money?" "Give it to the shelter." "All of it?" "Yes." "You're not keeping anything?" Annie shook her head. "They need it more." Mr. Carter leaned on the counter. "You know," he said, "most adults wouldn't give up their only bike to help someone else." Annie shrugged. "The kids there share their toys with me." Daniel smiled. "That sounds like a pretty good reason." Then he asked gently, "Would you show me the shelter?" Annie looked surprised. "You want to see it?" "I do." She thought about it for a second, then nodded. "Okay." Mr. Carter pointed toward the street. 3 blocks down," he said. "Old church building on the corner." Daniel picked up the bicycle and leaned it against his shoulder. "Well," he said with a small laugh, "I guess I own a bike now." Annie giggled softly. They walked outside together into the cool Chicago morning. As they started down the street, Daniel asked the question that had been sitting quietly in his mind. "Annie?" "Yes. If you sold your bike, how are you going to get to school?" Annie shrugged slightly. "I can walk. That's almost 2 miles. I don't mind." Daniel slowed his steps. "Not even in winter?" Annie smiled a little. "My grandma says walking makes you strong." Daniel laughed quietly, but inside, something deeper stirred. Because he had walked those same Chicago streets as a child too, and he knew exactly how long 2 miles could feel in winter. Ahead of them, at the end of the block, a modest brick building came into view. Annie pointed. "That's Hope Haven." Daniel followed her gaze. Children were playing quietly near the front steps of the shelter. Daniel Whitaker looked at the building for a long moment. Then he looked at the small girl walking beside him, and suddenly he had the strange feeling that buying that old pink bicycle might turn out to be the most important purchase he had made in years. The small brick building of Hope Haven stood quietly at the end of the block. its faded white cross still visible above the old wooden doors. The structure had once been a church decades ago, back when this part of Chicago had been filled with factory workers and young families who gathered every Sunday morning. Now the paint around the windows had begun to peel, and the narrow front steps had been repaired so many times that each board looked slightly different from the next. Annie walked ahead confidently, clutching the $40 carefully in both hands as if it were something fragile. Daniel followed beside her, the old pink bicycle resting lightly over his shoulder. A few children were playing in the small patch of yard beside the building. One boy kicked a worn soccer ball while two younger girls sat on the curb drawing shapes in the dirt with sticks. When they noticed Annie approaching, their faces brightened. "Annie," one of the girls shouted. Annie waved. "Hi." Daniel watched the interaction quietly. There was something about the way the children greeted her that suggested she came here often. They reached the front steps. Annie pushed the door open gently. Inside, the air smelled faintly of soup and laundry detergent. The building was warm, but the kind of warmth that came from effort rather than comfort. Folding tables filled the main room, and several mismatched chairs were arranged around them. A bulletin board hung on the wall covered with drawings made by children. Behind one of the tables stood a woman in her 60s placing canned food into cardboard boxes. She looked up. "Annie? You're here early today." Her name was Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, the director of Hope Haven. She had once been a school teacher before retiring, but retirement had not lasted long. When the local shelter had nearly closed 5 years earlier, she had stepped in to keep it running. Then she noticed Daniel standing in the doorway. "And who is this?" she asked politely. Annie smiled proudly. "This is Mr. Daniel." She lifted the money slightly. "He bought my bike." Mrs. Brooks blinked. "Your bike?" Annie nodded. "So I can help the kids." Mrs. Brooks set the box down slowly and walked closer. Her eyes moved from Annie to the old pink bicycle Daniel was holding, and then back again. "You sold your bike?" she asked gently. "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Brooks placed a hand on Annie's shoulder. "That was a very big sacrifice." Annie extended the money toward her. "This is for the shelter." Mrs. Brooks looked at the bills for a moment before accepting them carefully. "Thank you, Annie." Daniel watched the exchange quietly. There was no ceremony in the moment. No cameras, no applause, just a small girl giving away the only thing she owned to help other children. Mrs. Brooks turned toward Daniel. "Sir," she said kindly, "I appreciate your generosity." Daniel shook his head. "The generosity belongs to Annie." She smiled faintly. "Well, we are grateful either way." She gestured around the room. "You're welcome to look around if you'd like." Daniel nodded. "I would." Annie tugged gently at his sleeve. "Come on," she said. She led him deeper into the building. The shelter was modest but carefully maintained. A small kitchen stood at the back where a volunteer stirred something in a large pot. A hallway led to several rooms filled with bunk beds. Daniel paused when he saw the sleeping area. Metal frames, thin mattresses, a few stuffed animals placed carefully on pillows. He counted nearly 20 beds in the first room alone. Annie pointed to one of them. "That's where Maya sleeps." A little girl sitting nearby waved shyly. Daniel waved back. "How many kids stay here?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Brooks answered from behind him. "Right now, 42. Daniel turned. 42? She nodded. "Sometimes more." Daniel glanced around the room again. "Is the shelter funded by the city?" Mrs. Brooks sighed softly. "Partially, but most of our support comes from donations." She folded her arms lightly. "And donations have been slower this year." Daniel understood what that meant. The kitchen volunteer called out, "Lunch will be ready soon." Several children ran toward the tables. Annie watched them with a warm smile. "They like soup day," she whispered to Daniel. Daniel chuckled quietly. "I did too when I was their age." Annie looked up at him. "You stayed in a shelter?" Daniel paused. For a moment the room faded slightly around him. "I did," he admitted. "When I was about your age." Annie's eyes widened. "Really?" Daniel nodded. "My mom and I had some hard years." Annie seemed to think about that. Then she said something that made him smile. "Then you know how important soup day is." Daniel laughed softly. "Yes, I do." Mrs. Brooks watched the exchange with quiet curiosity. She had worked with children long enough to recognize something unusual happening. This man was not simply visiting, he was remembering. Daniel turned toward her again. "How long has Hope Haven been running?" he asked. 23 years. "And you've been director for 5? That's right." He nodded slowly. And you manage everything with donations? We do what we can. There was dignity in her answer, but Daniel could hear the strain behind it. Children were now filling the tables in the main room. Annie joined them, sitting beside a little girl and whispering something that made the child giggle. Daniel watched her for a moment. Then he turned back toward Mrs. Brooks. You know, he said quietly, Annie told me she's been trying to raise money for the shelter. Mrs. Brooks smiled softly. She has a big heart. Daniel looked at the room again. The worn tables, the mismatched chairs, the 42 children waiting patiently for lunch, and Annie sitting among them without the bicycle her mother had worked so hard to buy. Daniel Whitaker had spent most of his life building businesses, but standing inside Hope Haven, he began to realize something. Sometimes the most important investments were not financial ones. Sometimes they began with something much smaller, like a 6-year-old girl selling her bicycle. Daniel took a slow breath, and for the first time that day, a new idea quietly began forming in his mind. Lunch at Hope Haven was simple, but the room filled with the kind of quiet energy that came from children who were grateful for a warm meal. The large pot in the kitchen had been carried out to the serving table, and the volunteer ladled vegetable soup into bowls one by one. A basket of bread sat in the middle, and the children took pieces politely, some waiting patiently for seconds. Daniel stood near the wall watching. Annie sat among the children as if she had always belonged there. She slid a piece of bread toward a younger boy beside her before taking one for herself. You can have this one, she told him. The boy smiled. Thanks. Daniel noticed that Annie still held the remaining bills from the bicycle sale, folded carefully in her small hand. After a moment, she stood up and walked back to Mrs. Brooks. Here, Annie said softly, placing the money on the table again. Mrs. Brooks looked down. Annie, you already gave this to me. I just wanted to make sure you keep it safe, Annie replied. Mrs. Brooks laughed gently. I will. She placed the money inside a small metal box that sat on the corner of the table. It was labeled Donations in black marker. Daniel walked closer. That's where all the donations go? He asked. Mrs. Brooks nodded. Until we take them to the bank. Daniel glanced inside the box. There were a few small bills, some coins, and now Annie's $40. That's not much, he said quietly. Mrs. Brooks gave a tired smile. Some weeks are better than others. Daniel looked back at the tables where the children were eating. How do you manage with 42 kids? She folded her arms lightly. Carefully, he waited. After a moment, she continued. The city helps with part of the building expenses, but food, clothing, and supplies come mostly from donations. And if the donations slow down? Mrs. Brooks hesitated. We stretch what we have. Daniel had spent his life analyzing numbers, supply chains, budgets, profit margins. Even without seeing their books, he could already tell the shelter was operating on the edge. How long can you keep running like that? He asked. Mrs. Brooks looked at the floor briefly before answering. If we're lucky, another 6 months. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Across the room, Annie was laughing with the other children. She looked happy even without her bicycle. Daniel leaned slightly closer to Mrs. Brooks. Does Annie come here every day? Almost. She volunteers? She helps with the younger kids, Mrs. Brooks said with a smile. Sometimes she reads to them. Daniel watched Annie again. The 6-year-old girl who had just sold the only bike her mother had ever bought her was now happily sharing soup and bread with children who had even less. It was the kind of kindness that adults often talked about, but rarely practiced. Daniel walked slowly through the room. One boy was carefully coloring a picture with a dull crayon. Another child was trying to tape together a broken toy truck. Near the window, 2 sisters were sharing a single stuffed bear. Daniel stopped beside them. How long have you been here? He asked gently. The older girl shrugged. A few weeks. And before that? She pointed vaguely toward the city outside. Different places. Daniel nodded quietly. He had heard stories like that before. In fact, he had lived one. He stepped back toward Mrs. Brooks. You've kept this place running for 23 years, he said, with a lot of help. And not much money. Mrs. Brooks smiled faintly. That too. Daniel glanced toward the donation box again. 42 children, he said slowly. Yes, and Annie is trying to raise money by selling her bike. Mrs. Brooks nodded. She insisted. Daniel crossed his arms and looked around the room one more time. The cracked walls, the old tables, the volunteers trying their best, and Annie sitting among the children without the bike her mother had worked so hard to buy. Daniel Whitaker had spent most of his life building companies. He knew how to move millions of dollars across continents with a single phone call. But standing inside Hope Haven, something felt painfully simple. 42 children, 6 months of funding left. A 6-year-old girl selling her bicycle to help them survive. Daniel looked down at the old pink bike leaning against the wall. The chain still rusted, the basket still crooked, but somehow it had already done something extraordinary. It had brought him here. Daniel turned toward Mrs. Brooks. "What would it cost?" he asked quietly, "to keep this shelter running for a full year?" Mrs. Brooks blinked. "For a year?" "Yes," she thought carefully, "with food, utilities, repairs, and supplies." She hesitated. "Probably around $300,000. Daniel nodded slowly. $300,000. In the world he normally lived in, that was a rounding error. But inside this building, it was the difference between stability and closing the doors. Daniel looked back at Annie. She was helping a younger child wipe soup from his shirt. He smiled faintly. Sometimes the most important business decisions weren't made in offices. Sometimes they happened in places exactly like this. Daniel slipped his hands into his coat pockets. A quiet idea had now become something stronger, not just a thought, a decision waiting to be spoken. Mrs. Brooks noticed the look in his eyes. "Mr. Whitaker," she said carefully, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you really come here today?" Daniel looked toward Annie again. The answer was surprisingly simple. "Because a little girl sold her bicycle." Mrs. Brooks followed his gaze. Annie was still laughing with the other children. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Brooks felt something she had nearly forgotten. Hope. Daniel Whitaker looked around the room one last time, and in that moment he realized something very clearly. Buying Annie's bicycle had not been the end of the story. It had only been the beginning. Daniel Whitaker did not speak immediately. He stood near the doorway of the dining room at Hope Haven, watching the children finish their lunch. The soup pot was nearly empty now, and one of the volunteers was pouring the last bowls while another wiped down the tables. Across the room, Annie was helping the youngest boy carry his bowl back to the kitchen counter. "Careful," she told him gently. "It's still hot." The boy nodded seriously. Daniel noticed the way the other children listened to her. Not because she was older, many of them were, but because she carried herself with a quiet kindness that children recognized instantly. Mrs. Brooks stepped beside him. "They trust her," she said softly. Daniel nodded. "I can see that." They watched as Annie returned to the table and sat beside 2 girls who were finishing their bread. Mrs. Brooks folded her arms. "You asked earlier what it would cost to keep the shelter running for a year." Daniel looked back at her. "Yes. $300,000 would give us stability for 12 months. Daniel nodded slowly again. In the world he lived in, numbers moved quickly. Contracts worth tens of millions passed through conference rooms without anyone raising their voice. But inside Hope Haven, $300,000 felt like an impossible mountain. Mrs. Brooks studied him carefully. "You're thinking about helping, aren't you?" Daniel took a slow breath. "I'm thinking about what Annie already did." Mrs. Brooks glanced toward the little girl. Annie had just begun telling a story to the younger children, using animated hand gestures that made them laugh. "She has a remarkable heart," Mrs. Brooks said. Daniel looked at the pink bicycle leaning against the wall. "She sold the only thing her mother worked months to buy." "Yes, and she didn't hesitate." Mrs. Brooks nodded. "That's Annie." Daniel slipped his hands into his coat pockets. "I've spent most of my life building businesses," he said quietly. "Logistics, shipping routes, distribution centers." Mrs. Brooks listened. "But sometimes," Daniel continued, "the most important investments aren't the ones you plan." He looked back at the children. "They're the ones that find you." Mrs. Brooks smiled faintly. "That's a beautiful thought." Daniel took a step toward the center of the room. "Mrs. Brooks." "Yes. If Hope Haven had stable funding, what would change?" She didn't need to think long. "We could repair the building, replace the beds, expand the food program." She pointed toward the hallway. "We could add tutoring programs, after-school activities." Her voice softened. "Maybe even counseling services for some of the kids." Daniel nodded slowly. "And how many children could you help then?" Mrs. Brooks answered without hesitation. "Twice as many." Daniel looked around the room again. 42 children. In a building that was already struggling. He turned back to her. "Then maybe we should start planning." Mrs. Brooks blinked. "I'm sorry?" Daniel smiled. I think Hope Haven deserves more than 6 months of survival. She stared at him. You mean, I'd like to help. Mrs. Brooks exhaled slowly. How much help are we talking about? Daniel glanced again at Annie. The little girl was now showing another child how to fold a napkin into a small triangle. Enough, he said quietly, to make sure Annie never has to sell another bicycle. Mrs. Brooks felt her throat tighten slightly. Daniel continued. I'm going to set up a fund. A fund? For Hope Haven. She waited. At least $5 million. For a moment, Mrs. Brooks said nothing. The number hung in the air like something unreal. 5 million? She repeated quietly. Daniel nodded. That should secure the shelter for many years. Mrs. Brooks covered her mouth with one hand. You're serious? I am. Her eyes began to fill with tears she had spent years learning how to hide. Mr. Whitaker. Daniel raised a hand gently. This isn't charity, he said. It isn't? No. He nodded toward Annie. This is an investment. Mrs. Brooks followed his gaze. The 6-year-old girl who had sold her bicycle was now laughing with the other children. Daniel continued softly. An investment in the kind of kindness that can change a city. Mrs. Brooks wiped her eyes quickly. I don't even know what to say. Daniel smiled. You can start by letting me meet the rest of your team. She laughed weakly. That's easy. Just then Annie ran toward them. Mr. Daniel. Daniel knelt down slightly. Yes. Did you see the soup? She asked excitedly. It's my favorite. Daniel chuckled. It looked pretty good. Annie looked up at him. Are you going to visit again? Daniel thought for a moment. Actually, he said, I think I might be around a lot. Annie tilted her head. Why? Daniel pointed toward the pink bicycle leaning against the wall. Because that bike might turn out to be the best purchase I've ever made. Annie smiled. And in that moment, neither she nor the children around her had any idea that the small shelter they called home was about to change forever. The afternoon sun had begun to settle over Southside Chicago, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalks outside Hope Haven. Inside the shelter, the children had finished lunch and scattered into small groups around the room. Some were coloring at the tables, others were playing quietly with the few toys the shelter owned. Annie sat cross-legged on the floor beside 2 younger children, helping them build a small tower out of wooden blocks. Careful, she said softly. If you stack the big one first, the little ones won't fall. The younger boy nodded seriously and placed the block exactly where she showed him. Across the room, Daniel Whitaker stood beside Mrs. Brooks near the kitchen doorway. He watched Annie for a moment before speaking. She does that a lot? He asked. Mrs. Brooks followed his gaze. Every day. She helps the younger kids. Mrs. Brooks smiled gently. Sometimes I think she forgets she's only 6. Daniel nodded slowly. He had seen leadership in boardrooms and executive meetings. But something about the way Annie cared for the younger children felt more genuine than most things he had seen in corporate life. Just then the front door opened. A tall man wearing a delivery jacket stepped inside carrying 2 boxes. Afternoon, Mrs. Brooks, he said. Tom, she replied warmly. You made it. Tom placed the boxes on the table. Local grocery store had extra bread today, he explained. Figured the kids could use it. Mrs. Brooks shook his hand gratefully. Thank you. That means a lot. Tom noticed Daniel standing nearby. Visitor? He asked. Mrs. Brooks smiled. More than that. Tom raised an eyebrow. Well, anyone helping around here is a friend of mine. Daniel nodded politely. Nice to meet you. Meanwhile, Annie had noticed the boxes. She ran over. Bread. Tom laughed. That's right. She peeked inside. There's a lot. Tom shrugged. Kids need to eat. Daniel watched the moment quietly. Small acts of kindness seemed to hold the entire place together. Mrs. Brooks turned back to Daniel. People around here help when they can, she explained, but it's never enough. Daniel understood what she meant. Even the most generous community couldn't carry a shelter forever without stable funding. Tom looked at Daniel again. You from around here? He asked. Daniel hesitated. I grew up a few blocks away. Tom nodded approvingly. Then you know this neighborhood. I do. Annie returned to the table holding a loaf of bread. She suddenly remembered something and ran back to Daniel. Mr. Daniel. Ip. Yes? You didn't tell them about the bike. Tom looked confused. What bike? Annie pointed proudly toward the wall. The one he bought. Tom walked over to look at the faded pink bicycle. You sold your bike? He asked Annie. She nodded. So I could help the shelter. Tom blinked. Well, I'll be. Mrs. Brooks crossed her arms with a small smile. That bike might be the most valuable thing that's passed through this building in years. Daniel chuckled softly. You might be right. Tom leaned the bicycle upright and examined it. Not much to look at, he said. No, Daniel agreed. But it started something important. Tom looked between them. What do you mean? Mrs. Brooks took a slow breath. Mr. Whitaker here just promised to help fund Hope Haven. Tom frowned slightly. How much help? Daniel answered calmly. $5 million. Tom froze. You're kidding. I'm not. The delivery driver looked around the room again as if seeing it differently. You're serious. Daniel nodded. Tom let out a long whistle. Well, I guess Annie just changed this place. Across the room, the children were still playing, completely unaware of the conversation happening near the kitchen. Annie tugged Daniel's sleeve. Mr. Way. Daniel? Daniel? Yes? Does that mean the shelter will stay open? Daniel knelt so he could look her in the eyes. It means Hope Haven will be here for a very long time. Annie smiled so brightly that even Tom laughed. Looks like you just became a hero around here, kid, he said. Annie shook her head. I'm not a hero. Tom raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah? I just wanted to help my friends. Daniel stood again, quietly absorbing the moment. A 6-year-old girl had sold her bicycle, and because of that simple act, an entire shelter was about to be saved. Outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower behind the buildings of Chicago, but inside Hope Haven, something brighter had already begun. A story that would soon travel far beyond this small neighborhood, and it had started with a single worn pink bicycle. The next morning in Southside Chicago began the way most mornings did, quietly, with the distant rumble of buses and the smell of coffee drifting from small neighborhood cafes. But inside Hope Haven, something felt different. Mrs. Brooks was already awake before sunrise, standing at the small desk in her office with a cup of tea in her hand. The shelter had been running for more than 2 decades, and she had learned to wake early long before the children stirred. Morning hours were the only time the building truly belonged to silence. Yet today her mind was anything but quiet. $5 million. Even saying the number out loud still felt unreal. She looked down at the notes she had scribbled the night before: repairs needed for the roof, replacement beds, better heating for winter, a new kitchen stove. Things she had dreamed about fixing for years but never believed possible. A soft knock came at the door. Come in, she said. Daniel Whitaker stepped inside holding 2 cups of coffee. I figured you might be awake, he said, with a small smile. Mrs. Brooks laughed. You figured correctly. He handed her one of the cups. Black coffee, thank you. They sat for a moment in comfortable silence. Daniel looked around the small office. The walls were covered with photos of children who had passed through Hope Haven over the years. Some were old enough now to have families of their own. 23 years, Daniel said quietly. Mrs. Brooks nodded. Long enough to see a lot of lives change, and a lot of struggles. That too. Daniel leaned back in the chair. Have you told anyone yet? Mrs. Brooks shook her head. No. Why not? She smiled gently. Because I still want to make sure yesterday wasn't a dream. Daniel chuckled. It wasn't. At that moment, laughter echoed down the hallway. The children were waking up. Footsteps ran across the wooden floors as doors opened and voices filled the building. A few seconds later, Annie appeared in the office doorway. Her curls were slightly messy from sleep, and she was still wearing the oversized sweater she had slept in. Good morning, she said cheerfully. Daniel smiled. Morning, Annie. She stepped inside. I told the kids you were coming back. Mrs. Brooks raised an eyebrow. You did? Annie nodded proudly. They didn't believe me. Daniel laughed. Well, I guess I'll have to prove you right. Annie suddenly remembered something. Wait. She ran out of the office and came back a moment later dragging the pink bicycle behind her. You forgot your bike yesterday, she said. Daniel looked at it. The bent basket, the taped seat, the rusted chain. He smiled. I was wondering where I parked that. Annie tilted her head. You really want it? Daniel nodded. I do. Why? He thought for a moment. Because it reminds me of something important. Annie seemed satisfied with that answer. Just then, Mrs. Brooks's phone began ringing on the desk. She frowned slightly. Who could be calling this early? She answered. Hope Haven Shelter. There was a pause. Then her eyebrows slowly lifted. Yes, that's correct. Another pause. She glanced toward Daniel. I see. Her voice became careful. Yes, she's here. Annie looked curious. Mrs. Brooks covered the phone. They're asking about you. Me? Annie asked. Yes. Who is it? Mrs. Brooks looked back at the phone. A reporter. Daniel sat up slightly. Already? Mrs. Brooks nodded slowly. It seems someone heard about the bicycle. Annie blinked. The bike? Daniel exchanged a quiet glance with Mrs. Brooks. News traveled fast in cities like Chicago, especially when a story carried something rare. Hope. Mrs. Brooks spoke into the phone again. Yes, Annie is here. Another pause. Yes, Mr. Whitaker is here too. Daniel rubbed his forehead slightly. Looks like the story is spreading. Mrs. Brooks finished the call and hung up. Well, she said slowly. That was Channel 7 News. Annie's eyes widened. The TV? Mrs. Brooks nodded. They want to come interview you. Me? Yes. Annie looked completely confused. But I didn't do anything. Daniel smiled gently. You sold your bicycle to help 42 children. Annie shrugged. That's not a big thing. Mrs. Brooks laughed softly. Sometimes the smallest things are the biggest stories. Outside, the first rays of morning sunlight were beginning to shine through the shelter windows. Daniel looked at Annie and the pink bicycle. What had started as a quiet moment inside a repair shop was now becoming something far larger. A story about kindness. A story about a little girl who believed helping others mattered more than keeping the only thing she owned. And by the end of the day, that story would begin spreading across the entire city. The news van arrived just after 9 in the morning. Children at Hope Haven noticed it before anyone else. A white van with the bright blue logo of Channel 7 News slowly rolled to a stop along the curb outside the shelter. 2 people stepped out, one carrying a camera, the other holding a microphone and a small leather notebook. Inside the shelter, Annie was sitting at the dining table drawing pictures with 3 younger children when one of the boys ran to the window. Annie! He shouted. There's a TV truck outside. The room instantly filled with excited whispers. Mrs. Brooks stepped out of her office and walked toward the window. Daniel followed a moment later, already guessing what he would see. The reporter and cameraman were setting up equipment on the sidewalk. Well, Mrs. Brooks said softly. They weren't kidding. Annie looked up from her drawing. Who is it? The news station, Daniel answered gently. Annie blinked. They really came? It looks like they did. The front door opened and the reporter stepped inside. She was in her early 30s, dressed neatly but comfortably, with the kind of calm confidence that came from years of talking to strangers for a living. Good morning, she said politely. Mrs. Brooks greeted her. Welcome to Hope Haven. The reporter extended her hand. I'm Lisa Ramirez from Channel 7 News. Thank you for allowing us to visit. Mrs. Brooks shook her hand. We weren't expecting quite this much attention. Lisa smiled warmly. Stories like this travel quickly. She glanced around the room, noticing the children watching curiously. And I believe Annie is here? Annie slowly stood from the table. That's me. Lisa's expression softened immediately. You're Annie? Annie nodded. Lisa crouched slightly so she wasn't towering over her. Hi, Annie. My name is Lisa. Hi. Lisa pointed gently toward the pink bicycle leaning near the wall. Is that the bike? Annie nodded again. Yes. Lisa looked impressed. That bike is becoming famous around Chicago this morning. Annie looked confused. It is. Daniel chuckled quietly from behind her. It seems so. Lisa glanced toward him. And you must be Mr. Whitaker. Daniel nodded politely. That's right. Thank you for coming today, Lisa said. Your story and Annie's is inspiring a lot of people. Daniel shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. The inspiration belongs to Annie. Lisa smiled. That's what we've been hearing. She looked back at Annie. Would you mind answering a few questions? Annie looked toward Mrs. Brooks. Mrs. Brooks gave a reassuring nod. It's okay. Annie turned back to the reporter. Okay. Lisa sat in one of the chairs so they could speak at the same level. Annie, she began gently. Can you tell us why you decided to sell your bicycle? Annie thought for a moment. The kids here needed help. Lisa waited. And the bike was the only thing I had to sell. Lisa nodded slowly. Was it hard to give it up? Annie looked toward the bicycle. A little. Why? My mom worked a long time to buy it. The room grew quiet. Lisa asked softly. Then why did you still decide to sell it? Annie answered without hesitation. Because the kids here needed help more than I needed a bike. Even the cameraman paused for a moment before continuing to film. Lisa smiled gently. That's a very big heart for someone your age. Annie shrugged. I just wanted to help my friends. Lisa stood and turned slightly toward Daniel. And Mr. Whitaker, you were the one who bought Annie's bicycle? Daniel nodded. I was. What made you do it? Daniel looked at Annie for a moment before answering. Because sometimes a child reminds you what real generosity looks like. Lisa smiled. That's a powerful statement. Daniel glanced toward the children eating breakfast. I grew up not far from here. He continued. Places like Hope Haven helped families like mine survive. Lisa nodded thoughtfully. So Annie's decision reminded you of that? It did. And now you've pledged $5 million to support the shelter. Daniel gave a modest shrug. It seemed like the right thing to do. Behind them, several children whispered excitedly to each other. 5 million. That's a lot. Annie leaned toward Daniel and whispered quietly. Is 5 million bigger than 40? Daniel laughed softly. Yes, Annie. Much bigger. Lisa heard the exchange and smiled. Well, she said, looking back toward the camera. I think that explains why this story is touching so many people today. She turned again to Annie. One last question. Annie nodded. If you could tell people watching this story something, Lisa asked, what would you want them to know? Annie thought very carefully. Then she said something so simple that everyone in the room fell silent again. Helping people is more important than keeping things. The cameraman lowered the camera slightly. Lisa nodded slowly. I think Chicago just learned a very important lesson from you today. Outside, the Channel 7 van remained parked along the street as neighbors began to gather nearby, curious about what was happening inside the shelter. And as the story aired later that afternoon, Annie's small act of kindness and the pink bicycle that started it all would begin spreading far beyond the streets of Southside Chicago. By late afternoon, the story had already begun to spread. At first, it was just a short segment on the local Channel 7 broadcast. The clip showed Annie standing beside the worn pink bicycle, speaking shyly into the microphone while Daniel Whitaker stood quietly behind her. But something about the story caught people's attention. Maybe it was the image of a 6-year-old girl selling the only bike her mother had saved months to buy. Maybe it was the simple way Annie had explained it. Helping people is more important than keeping things. Within an hour of the broadcast, the video clip had been uploaded to the station's website. Then someone shared it on social media. Then someone else shared it again. By early evening, the story had traveled far beyond Southside Chicago. Inside Hope Haven, none of the children knew any of this. They were busy finishing their homework at the long dining tables while Mrs. Brooks moved between them, offering help with spelling and math. Daniel sat nearby reviewing emails on his phone when Mrs. Brooks's computer made a soft notification sound. She glanced at the screen. Then she frowned. That's strange. Daniel looked up. What is it? Another email. From who? She clicked the message. Someone from Milwaukee. What do they want? Mrs. Brooks read aloud. Hello. I just saw the story about Annie on the news. I'd like to donate $50 to help the children at Hope Haven. She looked at Daniel. That's kind. Before he could reply, another notification appeared. Then another. Mrs. Brooks blinked. Wait. There's another one. She opened it. This one is from a teacher in Indiana. Daniel stood and walked closer to the desk. What does it say? Mrs. Brooks read slowly. My students watched Annie's story today. They collected money during class and would like to send $120. Daniel smiled. That's incredible. Another notification appeared. Then another. Within minutes, the email inbox began filling rapidly. Donations. Messages. Offers to help. Mrs. Brooks stared at the screen in disbelief. I've never seen anything like this. Daniel leaned against the desk, watching quietly. What are people saying? She scrolled. Some are sending money. Others are offering clothes. A restaurant owner wants to deliver food every Friday. She looked up. All because of Annie. Across the room, Annie was sitting with 3 children, reading from a picture book. She had no idea what was happening at the computer. Daniel folded his arms. Sometimes the world just needs a reminder, he said softly. Mrs. Brooks nodded slowly. A reminder of what? That kindness still exists. Just then, the shelter phone rang. Mrs. Brooks answered. Hope Haven Shelter. She listened for a moment. Yes, this is Mrs. Brooks. Her eyes widened slightly. Yes, Annie is here. Daniel watched her expression change. Of course, she continued. That would be wonderful. She hung up slowly. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Another reporter? Mrs. Brooks shook her head. No. Then who? She exhaled in amazement. That was a bookstore downtown. And? They want to host a fundraiser. Daniel chuckled softly. Well, that didn't take long. Mrs. Brooks looked around the room again. The shelter suddenly felt different. Hope Haven had always survived on small acts of generosity, but now something larger was happening. Annie closed her book and walked toward them. Mrs. Brooks? Yes, Annie. Why does your computer keep making noises? Mrs. Brooks smiled warmly. Because people want to help. Annie tilted her head. Why? Mrs. Brooks gently pointed toward the pink bicycle leaning against the wall. Because of that bike. Annie looked at it. Then she shrugged. It's just a bike. Daniel knelt beside her again. Not anymore, he said. What is it now? Daniel smiled. Now it's a story. Annie thought about that. Then she asked something very serious. Is the shelter going to be okay? Daniel nodded. Yes. Mrs. Brooks added softly. Better than okay. Annie smiled with quiet relief. Outside, evening lights began turning on across the neighborhood. Inside Hope Haven, the inbox kept filling with messages from strangers who had watched the story and decided they wanted to help. A teacher in Ohio, a firefighter in Michigan, a grandmother in Texas who mailed $20 with a handwritten note that said, "For Annie and her big heart." Daniel Whitaker looked around the room once more. 42 children, a shelter that had nearly run out of funding, and a story that had now reached thousands of people, all because one little girl believed helping others mattered more than keeping the only thing she owned. Daniel smiled quietly. The pink bicycle had started something, and the world was beginning to answer. 2 days after Annie's story aired on the evening news, Hope Haven woke up to a morning unlike any it had ever seen. Mrs. Brooks opened the front door just after sunrise, as she had done for years. Normally, the street outside would be quiet, just the occasional car passing and the soft rumble of a city bus turning the corner. But that morning, there were already people waiting. 3 volunteers stood near the steps holding boxes. A man in a bakery apron was unloading trays of fresh bread from the back of a van. And parked along the curb were 2 more news vehicles. Mrs. Brooks paused in the doorway, stunned. "Oh my," she whispered. Behind her, Daniel Whitaker stepped into the hallway. "What is it?" She gestured toward the street. "I think the whole city heard Annie's story." Daniel stepped outside beside her. The bakery owner noticed them immediately. "Morning," he called. Mrs. Brooks walked down the steps. "Good morning." The man lifted one of the trays. "My name's Frank. I run the bakery on 51st Street. He smiled warmly. "I saw Annie on the news." Mrs. Brooks nodded. "That seems to be happening a lot." Frank laughed. "Well, after hearing her talk about those kids here, I figured the least I could do was send breakfast." He gestured toward the trays. "Fresh bread, cinnamon rolls. Enough for everyone." Mrs. Brooks pressed a hand to her chest. "Frank, that's incredibly generous." He shrugged. "That little girl reminded a lot of us what kindness looks like." Meanwhile, the volunteers began carrying boxes inside. Daniel helped lift one. "What's in these?" he asked. "Coats," one woman replied. "Winter coats for the kids." Another box was filled with books, another with toys. Inside the shelter, the children had begun to wake up. When Annie stepped into the main room and saw the growing pile of boxes, her eyes widened. "Mrs. Brooks?" "Yes, Annie. Why are there so many things?" Mrs. Brooks smiled softly. "Because people want to help." Annie looked confused. "But why?" Daniel leaned against the table. "Because they heard your story." Annie glanced toward the pink bicycle, still resting against the wall. "The bike?" "Yes," Daniel said. Before Annie could ask another question, a woman with a microphone stepped through the doorway. "Good morning." Daniel recognized her immediately. "Lisa Ramirez from Channel 7. "Looks like the story grew," Daniel said. Lisa laughed. That might be the understatement of the week. Behind her, a cameraman set up near the doorway again. Lisa walked toward Annie. "Hi, Annie." "Aja." "Hi." Lisa smiled. "You remember our interview?" "Yes. Well, people all across Chicago watched it." Annie blinked. "Really?" "Really." Lisa gestured toward the growing stacks of donations. "And this is what happened after." Annie looked around slowly. "The bread, the coats, the toys, all of it. For the shelter?" she asked quietly. Lisa nodded. "For the shelter." Annie thought about that for a moment. Then she looked up at Daniel. "Did the bike do that?" Daniel smiled gently. "In a way, yes." Lisa turned slightly toward the camera. "We're here again at Hope Haven Shelter," she began, "where the story of a 6-year-old girl who sold her bicycle to help other children has now inspired donations from across the city. The cameraman zoomed out, capturing the busy room. Volunteers sorting supplies. Children laughing as they opened boxes. Mrs. Brooks wiping tears from her eyes. Lisa continued. And today, the mayor of Chicago has made an announcement. Daniel raised an eyebrow. The mayor? Lisa nodded. She watched the story last night. And? Lisa smiled. She's inviting Annie to City Hall tomorrow. Annie looked startled. City Hall? Lisa crouched beside her again. The mayor wants to thank you personally. Annie blinked several times. But I didn't do anything special. Lisa smiled warmly. That's the thing about kindness, Annie. She glanced around the room. Sometimes the smallest act can change an entire city. Across the shelter, the children were already enjoying the cinnamon rolls Frank had brought. The smell of fresh bread filled the room. Daniel watched Annie quietly. Just a few days earlier, she had walked into a repair shop with one old bicycle and a simple goal to help her friends. Now her story had reached thousands of people. And tomorrow, she would be standing in City Hall. Daniel looked again at the worn pink bike. It leaned against the wall exactly where he had placed it. Rusty chain, bent basket, tape on the seat. Still the same old bicycle. But somehow it had already changed far more lives than anyone could have imagined. Annie tugged Daniel's sleeve. Mr. Daniel? Yes? Do you think the mayor likes bikes? Daniel laughed. I guess we'll find out tomorrow. The morning Annie visited Chicago City Hall was colder than usual. A thin layer of frost covered the sidewalks, and the tall buildings downtown reflected the pale winter sunlight, like glass towers stretching toward the sky. For Annie, who rarely left her neighborhood on the south side, the city center looked enormous. She sat quietly in the back seat of Daniel Whitaker's car, her eyes wide as she looked out the window. Everything is so tall, she whispered. Daniel smiled from the front seat. Chicago likes its buildings big. Beside Annie sat Mrs. Brooks, holding Annie's small coat closed against the cold. Nervous? Mrs. Brooks asked gently. Annie shook her head. Just curious. Daniel laughed softly. That's a good way to be. The car pulled to a stop in front of City Hall, a large stone building that had stood at the center of Chicago's government for more than a century. Reporters were already waiting outside, cameras resting on their shoulders. When Annie stepped out of the car, the reporters immediately noticed. There she is, someone said. Flashes from cameras lit up the sidewalk. Annie froze for a moment. Daniel leaned down beside her. Just walk with me, he said calmly. She nodded. Together they walked toward the entrance. Inside City Hall, the atmosphere was calmer but still busy. Staff members moved quickly through the halls carrying folders and documents. A tall woman in a navy suit approached them. Mr. Whitaker, she said warmly. Welcome. Daniel shook her hand. Good morning. The woman looked down at Annie and smiled. And you must be Annie. Yes, ma'am. My name is Mayor Patricia Langford. Annie's eyes widened slightly. The mayor? Mayor Langford laughed. That's what they tell me. She knelt down so she was eye level with Annie. I saw your story on the news. Annie shifted her feet shyly. You did? I did. The mayor glanced toward the pink bicycle Daniel had insisted on bringing with them. And that must be the famous bicycle. Annie nodded. It's old. Mayor Langford smiled. Maybe. But it carried a very big idea. They walked together into a large conference room where several city officials and reporters were waiting. A small podium stood at the front. The mayor stepped behind it. Good morning, she began. The room quieted. Over the past few days, the city of Chicago has been reminded of something very important. She gestured toward Annie. That kindness does not depend on age. Cameras flashed. Mayor Langford continued. A 6-year-old girl named Annie sold the only bicycle she owned so she could help children living at Hope Haven Shelter. She paused. Her act inspired donations across our city and reminded us that compassion is one of Chicago's greatest strengths. Applause filled the room. Annie looked slightly overwhelmed. Mayor Langford smiled and held out her hand. Annie, would you come stand beside me? Annie walked up to the podium slowly. The mayor handed her a framed certificate. Today, the city of Chicago would like to recognize Annie Johnson for her extraordinary kindness and generosity. More applause followed. Annie stared at the certificate. What does it say? She asked quietly. The mayor laughed. It says the city is very proud of you. Annie looked toward Daniel. Did the bike do all this? Daniel smiled gently. I think your heart did. Mayor Langford leaned toward the microphone again. And we have one more announcement, she said. The room grew quiet. In honor of Annie's generosity, the city will be partnering with Mr. Bell, Whitaker to expand programs that support shelters and children in need across Chicago. Reporters immediately began writing notes. Mayor Langford continued, "This effort will be called the Annie Initiative." The crowd applauded again. Annie blinked. "They named it after me?" "Yes," Daniel said quietly, "because you started it." After the ceremony, reporters gathered around Annie. One of them asked, "Annie, how does it feel to be honored by the city?" Annie thought carefully before answering. "I just wanted to help my friends." The reporter smiled. Sometimes the simplest answers carried the most truth. As the ceremony ended, Daniel stood near the window looking out over the city skyline. Mrs. Brooks walked beside him. "You've changed a lot of lives this week," she said. Daniel shook his head. "No." He looked toward Annie, who was still holding the certificate with both hands. "She did." Outside City Hall, the pink bicycle leaned quietly against the wall. Still old, still scratched, still patched with tape, but now it had become something more. A reminder to an entire city that even the smallest act of kindness could start something extraordinary. The afternoon Annie returned from City Hall. The sky over Chicago was beginning to turn golden with the soft light of early evening. The tall buildings downtown slowly faded behind them as Daniel's car drove back toward the south side. Annie sat in the back seat holding the framed certificate carefully in her lap. She had read it at least 5 times already. "Mrs. Brooks?" she asked quietly. "Yes, Annie. Does this mean I did something important?" Mrs. Brooks smiled warmly. "It means you reminded people how important kindness is." Annie looked back down at the certificate again, thinking. Daniel glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "You did something even more important than that." "What?" Annie asked. "You reminded adults what they sometimes forget." "And what's that?" Daniel smiled. "That helping someone else can change the world." Annie nodded slowly, as if she was still trying to understand something very big. The car soon turned onto the familiar street where Hope Haven stood, but something looked different. Cars were parked along both sides of the road. People stood outside the shelter. Children were gathered on the front steps. As Daniel slowed the car, Annie leaned forward. "What's happening?" Mrs. Brooks leaned toward the window. "Oh my goodness." The moment Annie stepped out of the car, the crowd erupted in applause. The children ran toward her. "Annie, you were on TV? You met the mayor." Annie laughed as they surrounded her. "I brought the certificate," she said proudly, holding it up. Mrs. Brooks followed behind her, still stunned by the scene. Daniel stepped out last. Near the front steps stood Mr. Carter from the bicycle repair shop. He tipped his hat when he saw Annie. "Well, look who's famous now." Annie ran over to him. "Mr. Carter." He chuckled. "I saw you on the news." Behind him, something covered with a large cloth stood near the steps. Annie pointed. "What's that?" Mr. Carter looked toward Daniel. "I think that's his part." Daniel walked forward slowly. "You remember the bicycle you sold?" he asked Annie. "Yes. And how you said the kids here needed help more than you needed a bike." Annie nodded. Daniel pulled the cloth away. Underneath it stood a brand new pink bicycle. Shiny wheels, a bright basket, and a small silver bell on the handlebar. The children gasped. Annie stared. "That's for me?" Daniel nodded. "You deserve to ride again." Annie walked toward it slowly, almost afraid to touch it. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Mr. Carter leaned over and tapped the bell. It rang brightly. The children laughed. Daniel crouched beside Annie. "But there's one more thing." "What?" He pointed toward the building. Workers were standing nearby with construction plans and toolboxes. "The shelter is going to be renovated," Daniel explained. "New beds, a bigger kitchen, classrooms for tutoring." Annie's eyes widened. "For the kids?" "Yes." Mrs. Brooks wiped tears from her eyes. Daniel continued. "And the program we announced at City Hall today, the Annie Initiative," Mrs. Brooks said softly. Daniel nodded. "It will help shelters like Hope Haven all across Chicago." The crowd began applauding again. Annie looked around at everyone. The volunteers, the neighbors, the children, all smiling. She looked back at the new bicycle, then at the old one leaning quietly against the wall. "My old bike started all this?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "It did." Annie thought about that for a moment. Then she climbed onto the new bicycle. She pushed the pedals slowly, riding in a small circle on the sidewalk while the other children cheered. The bell rang again, bright, clear, Hope Haven filled with laughter. Daniel stood beside Mrs. Brooks watching the moment. "You know," she said quietly, I spent years trying to keep this place alive. Daniel nodded. And now? She looked toward Annie riding the bicycle. Now a 6-year-old girl reminded the entire city why it matters. Daniel smiled. Sometimes the most powerful change didn't begin in government offices. It didn't begin in business meetings. Sometimes it began with something very small. A child, a simple act of kindness, and an old pink bicycle that someone was brave enough to give away. As the sun set behind the buildings of Chicago, Annie rode the bicycle down the sidewalk again, laughing as the other children ran beside her. And for the first time in many years, Hope Haven was no longer a place struggling to survive. It had become something stronger, a symbol, a reminder that the world can change when even the smallest heart decides to help someone else. The story of Annie teaches us that true kindness does not depend on age, wealth, or power. A 6-year-old girl was willing to give up the only bicycle her mother worked so hard to buy because she cared about other children who had even less. Her simple act of generosity inspired a billionaire, touched an entire city, and changed many lives. The lesson for all of us is clear. Even the smallest act of compassion can create a ripple that spreads far beyond what we imagine. When we choose to care for others, we remind the world that kindness still has the power to make real change. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.